He's a restoration ecologist here at our Lake County Forest Preserves. He received his bachelor's from Lawrence University in Wisconsin and his master's from Northwestern University. He is part of the Natural Resources team where he manages habit restorations, leads plant monitoring programs, and prioritizes rare species conservation. He is part of an ambitious project that includes monitoring trees in every woodland, upland forest, and flatlands habitat within the Lake County Forest Preserves every 10 to 15 years. We are very fortunate that Dan agreed to share some of his expert knowledge with us today. I'm sure we will benefit from it. As we are coming to realize the care of our forests, woodlands, and all of it are necessary to the health and survival of our earth. We're grateful to you, Dan, for giving us this opportunity to listen and learn from an expert about this difficult and important work. Welcome,
could you
Dan.
repeat his full name because I cut you off at the beginning?
Dan Sandacz.
Perfect. All right, thank you for the introduction, Linda, and thank you all for allowing me to join you today on this beautiful day that we have at Greenbelt.
Oh, it is.
And
You're right.
so I wanted to start by sharing a little bit more about Greenbelt, talk about the background, and then I'll talk about the ecology, my favorite part, and then I'll talk about what's next. So a little more background about me. I am the site ecologist for Greenbelt Forest Preserve, which means I kind of make all the decisions for the restoration projects that we do, and anything that happens at Greenbelt, I know about it. So I'm the point man if you want it, and I know Mary, when she originally asked me to invite for the day, she was like, is there a brochure for Greenbelt? And I said, no, but I'm probably the closest thing to it. So I'll be your living brochure for the day. So I did pass around maps that you all could take a look at, and I'll bring mine up too. And so there's two of them, and we'll start by looking at the first one. And on it, you'll see that it's just an overall aerial of Greenbelt Forest Preserve. The Forest Preserve boundaries are in green. And you'll also notice this nice blue line along Green Bay Road. Green Bay Road is actually the division of our watersheds. So to the west is the Chicago River watershed, also known as the Chicago-Calumet watershed, and this is really the headwaters of the Skokie River. So this is a really important area hydrologically, and that will eventually drain into the Mississippi River and onwards into the Gulf of Mexico. And then to the east of Green Bay Road, everything flows directly into Lake Michigan. And so this area is really important for just the coastal thruway that it is for Lake Michigan. This is a really important area for migratory birds that are along Lake Michigan, and the hydrology and the ecology is just immense in Greenbelt. A little more about the origins of Greenbelt Forest Preserve. So around 1980, when urbanization was kind of rapidly picking up in the North Chicago, Waukegan area, municipality really wanted to kind of set aside green space in the area. And so alongside with the Lake County Forest Preserve District, it just made perfect sense to find a place in the area. So in 1992, the very first parcel was purchased that led to what is now Greenbelt. In total, we are at 595 acres today, and all of it is just, it is one of my favorite places to be, and I hope you'll also explore sometime today or sometime soon. And we also have a lot of new improvements recently, so not so recently, but the Cultural Center on the east side of the road, that was first opened to the public in 2000, and it is excellent that we have the opportunity to engage more with the community and offer a venue for special events, and just another way for people to engage with our nature preserves and forest preserves. So that's the overall kind of site view and background to Greenbelt. Now, if you'd like to flip over to your second map, you'll see there's a lot more colors. And it's a little bewildering with colors, but let me kind of break it down for you. So this whole layer, it's pretty much the same map except this habitat classification layer. So our GIS analysts, GIS is the Geographic Information Systems, and alongside with our other ecologists, they went about to map all of our natural areas and kind of classify them into different areas such as prairies, woodlands, marshes, and etc. And this is really valuable because it gives us just a quick snapshot that I can share with you all today about what the habitat looks like at Greenbelt. And so you'll notice that there's quite a few different colors. Where we are currently on the west side, there's some wooded areas around us, and you can go through the color code. And further to the west, there's a lot of marsh wetland habitat. But in general, I want to point out how much of a diverse mosaic Greenbelt is. So this might not be readily apparent if you're not comparing site to site, but if you think about our other areas like Ryerson Conservation Area, for instance, it's really predominantly woodland. And that's excellent, but I think it's really important in the context of the ecology that Greenbelt is a cool mosaic of different habitats. And in particular, in the core of Greenbelt, this is one of the few areas where we have proper shrubland habitat. And that's very unique because it's one of the few areas that supports many rare shrubland bird species. And it's just this really unique area where there's a bunch of hawthorns and low-growing woody species that are really important for nesting habitat as well as food resources from the berries. And those thorny shrubs might not be very approachable to us, but they're really important for birds because they protect their nests and their eggs from raccoons and other predators that might go after them. So that is one of the reasons that I absolutely love Greenbelt. It's worth going around this inner loop just to do some bird watching. You can do that throughout the preserve as well, but that's one of my favorite spots. So the other areas I'll point out, just south of us in this dark green area, this is one of our remnant oak savannas. And so that's a little different from a woodland in the sense that the canopy is historically a little bit more open than a woodland would be. And it's true, it's important that we have a remnant area because that means that there really wasn't any agriculture there and a lot of the native vegetation and rare plant species are still intact. So this is one of my priorities for restoring and managing this area at Greenbelt. And so let's talk a little bit more about rare species. So I've mentioned the birds for sure, but there are plenty of endangered species that are out and about at Greenbelt. I can't say which ones, unfortunately, but we have rare insects, rare plants, rare animals, and it's very critical that we have that mosaic of habitat that I mentioned. So one instance, we have a rare snake, and it really relies on a kind of this gradient of woodland into shrubland, wetland, and prairie for different life stages or different needs. So it has different habitat needs for nesting, for eating, for sleeping, and it's really important that we can maintain that all in a continuous complex because otherwise we wouldn't have habitat for that species here. And so just keeping that in mind, and you can also think about frogs that need wetland areas when they're young as tadpoles up to in trees and wooded areas. So tree frogs are ones that come to mind. So just keep thinking about this mosaic, and I don't think that's something we talk about as much, but it is really critically important and something that puts Greenbelt on the map for why it's a really high quality natural area within our holdings. All right, and so now I'm gonna go a little bit more broad and talk about something that's related to my vegetation monitoring. So this little analysis, I'm not going to make you learn all the nitty-gritty behind the analysis. You can just enjoy the illustration by my colleague Tiani. But we were very interested in learning about how prescribed burning affects our plant communities. And prescribed burning is important because it is one of the most cost-effective tools that we have in our management arsenal, and it is also a critical process that our native communities were evolved and adapted to. So getting fire back on the landscape is really important, and we want to do it as much as we can. So to learn a little bit more about what fire does in our prairies and woodland landscapes that we are able to burn at so far is right here. You can see along here, this is our burn return interval, and that just means how often we're able to burn. And up here, you'll see these are just the species richness. That's the number of plant species in that given habitat. And it's a lot more clear up in the woodland areas, but when we have a burn of every 2 to 3 years or 3 to 4 years, that's when the species richness is highest in our areas. And so what that means is it's very informative for when we should be burning, and it's very indicative of that our native species rely on fire to make sure that certain species don't become too dominant and suppress other species. And so just trying to get fire back on the landscape restores this balance and health to the community. So that's what I'm trying to illustrate with that. I won't test you on the analysis parts of that, but I'm happy to talk more about it if you'd like. And so I know that was really a brief whirlwind, but I wanted to leave just ample time for questions if anyone had any. So that concludes my prepared talk, and I'm happy to take your questions. Yes?
Have you manipulated any of these little microbiomes by introducing certain plants, or did you just discover it as is and you're just maintaining what's there?
That's an excellent question. So Whenever we have approach a restoration, we try to do a mix of the historical species that were there, as well as planning for the future of climate change and what we think will be the most balanced and healthy for the community. So for instance, there might be some plant species that we can't necessarily verify were exactly here at Greenbelt historically, but we know that they're supposed to live in oak savannas, for instance. So one of my favorite plants is shooting star. That's one that I like to introduce into seed mixes because it's very important for early season bumblebees and whatnot to get their colonies going as a pollen resource. So that's a great question. That's how I approach that. Anything? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, I think it was a couple years ago now, the work that was done on the other side of the road, on the east side of Green Bay, and would be on the south end?
Yeah, so
Because people were like freaking out, oh my gosh, they're destroying the
yeah, I understand. So we do a lot of clearing projects, and the main enemy we're going after is common buckthorn. That's a species that just grows so dense and thick in here. There's some behind me, unfortunately, and it's omnipresent. It's 40% of our cover throughout Lake County. So it is public enemy number one in terms of invasive plants we go after. So primarily, that's the target we're going for when we're doing these big clearing projects to restore these areas. And it's really important that we get rid of that because one, it just grows too dense and will kind of crowd out other native vegetation. But it also does something where it releases chemicals through its roots and it will kill other plants in the area. And if it doesn't directly kill them, it will change pH or other soil chemistry such that native plants won't grow. So that's why we really go after it hard. And we have tons of volunteer programs. Our volunteer site steward is really gung-ho about getting rid of buckthorn at Greenbelt. She's terrific. And all over the place, we're doing our best to cut it back. So that's primarily what we're doing. But something new that we're getting into, so that was really phase one, getting rid of all the invasive species, buckthorn. But now we're trying to move into the more maintenance and thinning projects. So I was the manager of Van Patten Woods, the clearing project that happened this winter. And so some people notice, why did you cut down some of like the maples and some of the other trees? And it's because there's not enough light availability reaching the forest floor. And if we don't have enough light, then we can't have any of our wildflowers that grow in our woodlands. So it's part of, again, trying to maintain that balance. And if we think historically, it would have been really large animals like megafauna, like mammoths, bison, and things that were going after these saplings before they got too big. So we're trying to do what the old grazers used to do.
I'm not familiar with burning woodlands, I'm more familiar with burning prairie.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you do that?
It's a
Is it
great
dangerous?
question.
I mean, obviously,
I
you
mean-
have to protect the trees that.
Yeah, so as I said, our plants are adapted to fire, so a lot of them, the bark is such that it will be resistant to fire. And so obviously there will be dead trees that we keep an eye on, and we water them before fire moves through that area just to suppress that. And it's really not as much of a concern as most people would think.
Oh, really?
And yeah, so that was my surprise too. There's a few more just things we need to keep in mind as we're burning woodland areas just for the safety of our crews, because there could be more hazards like down trees and stuff that we can't see necessarily from the outside when we're burning a whole area of woodlands. But we definitely, it's not much different from a prairie. And it's, as I mentioned, you can see from our poster, I'll bring that up again, it is still really important to burn in our woodland habitats. They rely on that, and every 3 to 4 years we should be burning to maintain our native species in our woodland habitats. Yes?
I'm always interested in unintended consequences.
Mhm.
So whenever man starts manipulating nature, you know, we think we have predictable models of what will happen, but inevitably there are some unintended consequences.
Mhm.
Have you experienced any of those, and would you like to
Yeah.
share them, or is that top secret?
Well, that's honestly top secret. Let me talk about that a little more broadly. So before I came to this position, Linda mentioned I was at the Northwestern University for a master's. That program was plant biology and conservation in partnership with the Chicago Botanic Garden. So I was doing my research on a rare thistle that only grows on sand dunes. And back in the 70s or 80s, there were some individuals that tried to introduce a weevil to go after invasive thistles, but it went for our native thistles as well. And so that's one of the threats facing the endangered plant that I study. And it's kind of that unintended consequence that now, okay, I have to deal with that and manage that because it's out here and it's impossible for us
It's
to.
like the cane toad catastrophe in Australia.
Exactly. So things like biocontrol, I think in general the field is moving away from that because there are so many checks and balances. You don't know how, when you introduce a new cog in the system, how it's going to affect everything. So we are very much against that, so to speak. But in terms of how we're introducing things that may not necessarily have been in here, one of the projects I want to talk about is Growing Through Change. So our Director of Natural Resources, Patty Vitt, is doing this project at Grant Woods where she's introducing Southern Source seed. So it's the same species, but just they might have different genetics or genes that could help them be more resilient to the expected climate change scenarios in the future. So just trying to study that, I think that is the next step, and they would likely disperse north naturally with their kind of preferred habitat as climate changes anyway. But because everything's kind of so fragmented into little preserves, species can't move around like they used to. So we have to assist that. And that means introducing new seed that may not have been here necessarily, but we're not in the game of introducing new species just to see how they play out necessarily.
Sometimes they introduce themselves. I understand we have a bear now, so.
Yep. Right, and so there are a number of reasons that obviously animals are more mobile than plants, but there are a number of reasons why the bear might be around here looking for food resources. He might come around more often. These are things that
We heard
IG
about all
are
these
us.
great little microbiomes that Greenbelt decided to check out.
Yeah, right? He's got good taste.
Has he been spotted in this area?
I don't think this far south.
No.
Yeah, pretty much Antioch and Gurney.
Antioch, yeah.
Yeah.
On someone's back, yeah. They must have good food. They grilled the night before.
Probably.
Any other questions for me?
Well, you work with rare plants too. Do you find a big difference between the different forest preserves? Like something that's rare in one that they don't have in the other?
Yeah, so let me talk about one of the more recent additions. So you may have seen that St. Francis Woods at Independence Grove was just designated as old growth forest.
Oh, right.
So that's one of our areas that is similar to our woodland habitats that are kind of along the east side of the Des Plaines River, but it's unique because there wasn't any agriculture there. So there was no cattle grazing and there wasn't any pressures from agriculture, and it was named St. Francis Woods because it was owned by a Catholic church there, St. Francis Catholic Church. And so that's really important that there wasn't grazing because there's still a lot of grasses and rare plant species that would have been removed through agriculture. So that's a spot that's really unique and special to me, and just not even necessarily widespread. We have remnant sedge meadow in the core of Greenbelt, and you can probably spot it on your map. It's a little dark green section. It's about 1 acre, but it's really unique because there's sedges and all sorts of wetland plants that are just hanging on there that really you can't find anywhere else. So
Do you ever take, like try to get seed from one, especially if it's a rare one, and try to put it in another area to see if we can get some biodiversity?
absolutely. And so one plant that I'll mention we do that with is the Eastern Prairie Fringe Orchid. That's one of our endangered plant
Yeah.
species. And so we actually work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other forest reserve districts to do some like pollination. So I will go out this summer and hand pollinate these orchids and collect some of that pollen and exchange it with different populations so we can increase the movement of genes throughout them. And so we'll forgive that mowing for a minute, but but yes, definitely rare plants. I work very closely with my colleague Ken Click on that. He's been with the district for over 20 years, so he knows all of them like the back of his hand, and he's a terrific mentor to learn from, so I can kind of
Do you
take
ever find one you know is rare or
You know what? There's a number of times where there's species that I would refer to as northern relics, where they were probably here because of glaciation and then the removal. So at one point, this area, like there were pockets of boreal forest hanging on. So you might find a few species hanging on, like rare mosses, or there's a native honeysuckle that's really low growing. Some things like that that aren't necessarily really endangered species, but are just not necessarily supposed to be around here anymore. But we still want to maintain them and provide habitat for them. So just considering that in our management is a fun challenge.
I know Buckboard's depending on the one are
Yeah, reed canary grass is kind of up there with common reed, or Phragmites is the name you probably know. Those are two of our big wetland invaders. And so just keeping those in check is also a challenge. And it's something that we are in the process of going after in all of our holdings. But as you can imagine, with 31,000 acres, it's hard to be everywhere at once. And so one other thing I'll talk about is kind of this balance of maintaining our high quality areas and restoring new areas. So that balance, we try to balance that out. Although it's dependent on grant funding and then also where we want to allocate our resources. And so we only have so much funding, so many staff members to be everywhere. So we do our best. And for instance, what I almost forgot to mention is that I actually received 2 grants for Greenbelt this year. So I'll be doing some upcoming restoration work this winter. So we'll be clearing more buckthorn areas. The Oak Savanna area, we'll be doing clearing there. And so excellent. One was from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and another was from the Morton Arboretum. So we're very grateful for these opportunities and funding resources to be able to do more good work here. So.
And then just as a follow-up, are there any other plants, like do you have a top 10 or?
Oh, I mean, it really depends on the site. I guess let's go with the top 5. So buckthorn's top, and then Phragmites and reed canary grass. The worst herbaceous one is teasel. You've probably seen it on the roadside. I see some faces, you know it well, unfortunately. So that's one we go after a lot. We actually have a district-wide project to go after specifically teasel. That's how aggressive it is. But it responds well to herbicide and is treated very easily. So it's one that we are on top of and just have to maintain, because we can get rid of it from our preserves, but not everyone's managing it, so it'll just blow right back in, unfortunately. Another one that I like to put on everyone's radar is called calorie pear. So it's one that is a new invader in some of our areas, and Round Savannah is a place where, in my mind, we need to start going after it, because it kind of is in the same vein of buckthorn. And how it was introduced, there are 2 sterile cultivated versions of this pear, and they can't breed individually, but they hybridize. And so that's how the calorie pear is here now. And it is pretty aggressive, almost as aggressive as buckthorn, so we're gonna have to see how well it responds to our management strategies.
You mentioned wanting to plant with an eye to climate change. Have
Mhm.
you seen signs already of climate change?
Oh, absolutely. Right now, the severe drought that we're in, the amount of rain that we should have had up to this point, and the areas that should be wet that are not wet, it's not typical. And so whereas we would probably see that once in a blue moon, we're seeing it annually. So we need to prepare for drier conditions, more drought conditions. And it's unfortunate, because there's a lot of areas where they rely on very specific hydrology to be maintained, and that's not something, I can't bring more water in, it's not practical for me to go around and water everywhere. Luckily, our native communities are pretty robust and adapted to drought in times of drought, but there's only so much we can do in that regard. The silver lining is that the mosquitoes are kept at bay with drought conditions, but just something we have to deal with.
Sounds like really interesting.
Thank you very much.
So much of all the forest preserves and habitat areas, they have people that live around them. And I'm curious what you do to educate neighbors that could actually have more of an impact on a forest preserve or a conservation area, when they realize this is what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're doing our.
Can you repeat the question for the iPad?
Yeah, so the question was, and correct me if I'm wrong, more about how we can educate or work with neighbors that are adjacent to forest preserves to think about how what they do on their habitat impacts our forest preserves. One of our initiatives that my colleague started is called Healthy Hedges, and you may have seen that in the buckthorn free flags. We're doing our best to educate folks about buckthorn and just getting rid of it in any area that we can, because as I said with teasel, if we get rid of it in our preserves, it could blow right back in. And so making sure that we're doing our best to buffer preserves and natural areas on your own landscapes is really important, to make sure that we kind of minimize the spread and movement of invasive species the best we can. Likewise, you can also provide habitat for native species. And so native gardening and landscaping, if you're interested, is a very good opportunity to provide habitat for pollinators and all sorts of native species. So I could talk for hours about that, so I'll come into stuff there. Right.
What is a safe way of growing native popcorn
Yeah,
for garden or something like that?
yeah. So the safest way, if it's very young, you can hand pull it, but it starts to root deeply after that. So if it's still small and you can use clippers, I'd recommend that. Otherwise, you can get someone to use a chainsaw safely. And herbiciding is the best way to make sure it won't come back. I know not everyone's comfortable with that, and in that case, I would just recommend keep clipping it.
Could you state that that's for buckthorn?
Yes, and that is for treatment of buckthorn.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I learned a lot, yes. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
We really appreciate you giving us the time. It's so true about buckthorn.
Could you
remove ours from the lawn.
Did you say 20 years ago is
Calorie pair.